Hello. Good afternoon, morning, evening. Hope this conversation finds you well wherever in the world you are. It is an honor and a thrill to have Kevin Young join me in conversation today. The topic for today is capturing voices. And I thought that was very appropriate given who Kevin is, what Kevin represents, and the impact that he has and certainly has made and certainly will make in the future. Let me start with an introduction. And as many of you know who have joined us before, I typically don't go through the specific details. But in this instance, I think it's particularly important to share a bit of the specifics around Kevin's journey. Kevin is a poet, an essayist, an editor, a professor, and the Andrew W. Mellon Director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, a role that he's held since 2021. It has been an honor for me to work with him in that context as a member of the council. Additionally, he's an award-winning author of 13 books of poetry and prose. And he is the poetry editor of The New Yorker, where he also hosts the Poetry Podcast. He's an editor of 9 volumes, most recently the anthology African American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle and Song, and it was named one of the best books of 2020 by the New York Times Book Review, Esquire, Time, and The Atlantic. Previously, Kevin served as the director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture at the New York Public Library. And he has, as I mentioned, been a professor for 2 decades associated with Emory. Why did I read all of these accolades? Because it highlights the journey, the intensity with which Kevin pursues everything and anything. So with that, Kevin, tell us your story as you want people to experience you, and give us insights as to how these things are threads that fit together in the fabric of who you are.
Well, thanks so much, Edith, and thanks for having me. It's a treasure and a pleasure working with you, and it's a pleasure being here today. I think for me, there's the bio that I think captures some of what I do, but maybe not why. The why is not obvious, and maybe even how that links with the museum. I get a lot of questions, why? How does a poet run a museum, or why? And I think there's a little bit of background that might help. But my family's from Louisiana, on both sides of my family, and from rural Louisiana. My parents were among the first in their families to go to college, and went all the way from the segregated South, and they went to HBCUs, at Southern University, the best band in the world, the Human Jukebox, my father became a doctor, my mother a chemist. So there's that science drive side of them, but there's also the culture and the stuff that I saw growing up, going to Louisiana, which we did and called home. And for me, I'd never seen, when I got to college and started really writing in earnest, my grandparents in a poem. I'd never heard their voices in that way. And for me, that's why I started writing poems in some way. It was less a choice than a vocation. It was a calling to write about them and capture the ways that they understood the world and told their own history, which was often oblique, not direct. They left things out on purpose, I'm sure, both from pain and pleasure. And there was a quality of laughter and joy, too, that I think I didn't always see. Sometimes we tell stories that focus only on tragedy, and I wanted to capture that complexity. Let's think of it like the blues, the laughing to keep from crying. And on one side of my family, my father's side, they play music, and on my mother's side, they preach quite a bit. And so somewhere in the two is poetry. But I also would say that, poetry also provided a kind of base for me to leap into these other things, whether it's thinking about history or working in archives and then museums. And for me, poets make these kinds of connections often between seemingly unrelated things. They make metaphors. They say this is like that. And I think very much museums do the same thing. They make meaning. They bring us in contact with images and objects that tell stories and that provide examples of our humanity, but also aren't asking or begging for it. Especially as a Black writer, I really want to capture the voices as a matter of fact, that these Black individuals, these complex figures, whether they're family members or historical figures, lived and breathed and thought and dreamt and cried and laughed. And to capture that fullness is something the museum also does and does incredibly well. And to be in a space like the National Museum of African American History and Culture, much less to lead it, is really a joy, because you see up close the ways that telling the truth, telling those stories in its fullest form, people really respond to, and they make connections with objects. But I also see them make community and connections with each other every day and over those same objects. And that's something I think the best of poetry does too, is it brings us out of ourselves a little bit. It makes us connect with whole history of human speech endeavors and experiences. You can read a poem from hundreds of years ago, or read a Langston Hughes poem, and suddenly you're that person for that time period. And I think what the museum does really well is that same kind of time travel. It takes you there. And, I think that's important, especially in this moment when some of those histories are being questioned or we're not supposed to teach them or talk about them. I think it's more important than ever to tell the full story, the unvarnished truth, as we were commissioned to do in the beginning. And, I think that always flows through poetry as well.
Well, thank you for sharing your journey and how, telling the stories and understanding and digging deeper into this perspectives of your grandparents and your parents and those in your communities is so important. I just want to say very directly, one must visit the museum. I do have the habit of calling it the museum.
Me too. I couldn't put Smithsonian's museum or the museum or, and of course we're one of 19 terrific museums. So, but I end up calling it that a lot.
And the reason that it is the museum is because for me and for so many, it is my story. And the museum highlights that it's representing a people's story and a nation's story. And so if you haven't had the opportunity to visit, I so encourage you to do so. It is one of, what did you say, Kevin? 19 museums on the mall.
We have the zoo and
the zoo and other things. And so how appropriate is it to pay tribute to, Black history, Black American history in this way? When you go, also pay attention to who's online with you, because you will be standing online. As the museum first opened, and I journeyed to see it for the first, second, third, fourth, whatever time, stood online, I was so struck by the fact that there were people from all over the world, certainly, but there were so many folks that I would consider my elders, people who would have been of my parents' generation, who were just beaming and itching, some with canes, some holding on to the family member or the friend that went, and watching them talk about what they were looking forward to seeing them standing in front of the exhibits and pointing to something that resonated, that represented them and pride. I'd also say, though, and Kevin, I'd love your thoughts on this, is that it's super and very important to recognize that there will be people online 50 years from now who are going to be thinking about this period as their history. And one of the things you've often shared with me is how important it is for a museum to be living, to evolve, to capture different perspectives. Can you share a little bit about that with those that are joining us in this conversation?
Sure. I think, we end up calling it living history in the museum. And I think it's really important because how do you capture now, which I think one of the things about living history is that idea of capturing the new and the now. But it's also helping people understand we're living through history, but also that history lives through us. And I think it's also important for young people to understand they too can make history. We don't just tell stories of famous people or people who we now know the names of. We also try to talk about communities and the ways they changed history and made culture. We tell unknown stories or lesser known stories. That's very important, whether we're telling that in the museum or online in our searchable museum, which is a really important initiative to kind of not only think about
Super exciting what you've done
Yeah.
there, Kevin. So thanks for drawing attention to.
Yeah. Well, it's just searchablemuseum.com, and you can see the ways that I think we have something like 5 exhibits now, from Slavery and Freedom to Afrofuturism, our latest show. And it's a way for people to be able to hold history in their hands. I think that's really important. And we saw as the pandemic hit, the ways that, we were at home or we were in our bubbles, and we were able, the Searchable Museum didn't exist yet, but we saw the import of online and digital, and that what I call the digital present. And the digital present is here. It's with us. And so Searchable is a way to do that. I think capturing that is so important. Something like Afrofuturism not only thinks about this present and thinks about the ways that the enslaved dreamed up new worlds, that Africans before enslavement thought about the future, thought about the stars, thought about astronomy and science, and that translated into what we now call Afrofuturism, and that there were Afrofuturists before the term, which was coined in the 1990s, and people like Sun Ra or John Coltrane or Alice Coltrane used outer space as a way to journey and think about here on Earth, but also create what Coltrane calls inner space. And that kind of journey from the exterior, from the stars to Earth, to inside of us, I think is really important. And that's the kind of thing we have to keep tracing. We have to keep people understanding and reinterpreting some of the things that are already in the museum. We've always had Afrofuturism, for instance. We have the mothership from Parliament Funkadelic upstairs, but to have it focused in is really important. And we'll continue to tell those stories, just as we tell stories of Reconstruction and enslavement, but also thinking about the future. So it's always, as you said, a living thing that we have to tend to and look forward to.
You mentioned the significance of community and the depth of the communities that one feels standing before every exhibit or every object. That resonates with me. That's what Medley is all about. Medley is about bringing people together to really understand other people's perspectives and learn and grow as a result of that. That's what Medley is. That's what often happens in the museum. Earlier, you mentioned that we are in an interesting time. And we are in a time where there are those that debate whether this history, the nation's history that is exhibited in the museum, is appropriate not only to share. Why do we call it the nation's history? Why is that an issue for all Americans, not just for people whose culture it celebrates, African Americans in this country?
Well, I think it's a rich history that we interpret the American story through an African American lens, and people can see familiar things from Thomas Jefferson, whose monument faces our museum, to Washington, to the present. And so having people understand the ways that, say Jefferson enslaved, hundreds of people on his property. And we have this, it's a powerful part of the museum that has every enslaved person, the name of every person we know, as a brick behind a statue of Jefferson. But it's important also to have that journey. I think it's an upward journey, and that's physically manifest in the museum. You start at the bottom usually and move your way through from 1400, because we want to really capture before enslavement, to the way that slavery and the modern world were really tied, and the wealth of slave trading nations really helped create the modern world. And understanding that, I think, helps us understand some of the connections to now. I mean, this history helps us think about the present, but also the future. And to not understand where we're from, where we're all from, and how intertwined we all are, I think doesn't do justice to, I think, the audiences that are really eager and excited to come to the museum. I see it every day, and you mentioned it. People wait online, and it's all kinds of people, and people are excited to make those connections with the objects we curate, but also to understand each other, and to eat some good food. We have a very good cafe that translates, those African-American foodstuffs and foodways that I grew up with, in a modern way. We have an Afrofuturism menu right now, for instance. So I think it's really important to see the ways that people break bread together, they connect, and it's something that people want. They want to make those kinds of connections, both with the past, but with each other.
Oh, that reminds me, Kevin, of advice that I often got from Vernon Jordan, a civil rights leader, extraordinary human, who always made time. And whenever I was stuck on a relationship or how to build a relationship, he would always say, "You need to break bread with that person, and
Right.
you need to break bread that you like. You
Right.
need to break it down.
Sure. Sure.
But I'd also mentioned that I've yet to have a meal, so I think that's got to be.
I mean, we got to fix that.
Visit.
We got to fix that. Yeah.
There's so much to do that the time is always filled.
Yeah.
When you are in the museum, and you're in the museum, I would imagine, when you're not traveling most days, can you share a couple of moments where you've overheard a conversation or heard someone have an aha moment where you thought, that's why this matters?
I mean, I've had many, some with people who are everyday visitors, but, some with families who've donated powerful objects to the museum. A couple of cases in point: when we first reopened after COVID in May 2021, and we're all masked, and, I was standing outside and greeting people and opening the doors up. And one of the first groups there was a family of who had donated objects related to the first woman killed in combat. And they had clearly waited, I'm sure, years to make this pilgrimage. And it was, parents and siblings and, related, all the relatives. And I just realized, if I hadn't before, how personal and intimate the museum is. I think that's the other thing people connect with, is the objects, even if you're not a donor, but it is yours. This museum we built for everyone, and people feel that kind of ownership in it. But I've also toured around Emmett Till's family, and to see, we have Emmett Till's casket in the museum, and to see the ways that the reverence and the restoration we took to make that casket a sacred space in the museum has been really powerful. And to see the ways that his story resonates, whether it's in the film that was recently made or people telling that story, but also that it's still relevant to other more recent events. And so that kind of connection that people make is just powerful. There's other elements of joy, like the mothership, but, that sacred trust that we have with people giving us their loved ones' effects is really powerful. And we try to honor that every day. And I think that's, our highest charge and calling.
And tell us what stories you'd like to be told in the museum that are not there today. You have an amazing group of curators that work with you on the team. What do you think is the future of opportunity to share things?
Well, things are always evolving. So we definitely, I like to think we've covered the ground. It's not so much what isn't there. It's like, what can we add and continue to grow? There's always more to tell. We have 40,000 objects.
40,000 objects, all.
But we only have about 3,000 on view at any time. And that's a pretty good ratio in my mind. We're close to 10% of our material, and we're always rotating. But we just recently added, for instance, the Johnson Publishing Company archive, which we co-own with the Getty Research Institute, and we're digitizing that. It's 4.5 million items, 10,000, audiovisual materials. And
for those that might know, tell us the publications from Johnson Publishing.
Yeah, Ebony and Jet are the probably two most famous. And Jet was in every barbershop and every house. We got it weekly.
We got it weekly. I collected them. I had stacks of them as a young child.
Right now.
Yes.
I probably have some back on the shelf behind me. But, for me, the Jet and Ebony, it told the news of the day, but also through this Black lens, celebrated Blackness, but also told important stories. Jet was who first ran the pictures of Emmett Till's lynched body, and that was a really important moment. So this is the archive of the 20th century and Black folks' images throughout, most of which haven't been seen, which is just what's incredible about it. Is I believe strongly we don't yet know what the 21st century is going to be like, but we don't totally know the 20th century either. And this is one of the insights into it. And that's one of the things we definitely want to get out there, both digitally in terms of going through those. It's not going to be 4.5 million right away, but we're hoping 80 or 90,000 will be ready soon, within a year or so, for people to peruse and to see themselves and see each other. And there's other stories to tell. I think Black fashion is a really interesting moment right now, and we want to tell some of those stories. And we're looking forward to telling some of those soon and throughout the year. We're also having a hip hop block party in August. So, we're trying to tell those stories as hip hop hits 50. And we've done that through an anthology of music, hip hop anthology, but also through events.
And Kevin, I can't thank you enough for your patience as I explore the world of hip hop at a different level. You don't react when I sort of get that look on my face. You keep bringing me in. You keep expanding my awareness, and my children and colleagues are grateful for that.
Yeah, you'll get there. Don't worry.
Thank you so much. So I before we come to a close here, I do want to just spend a bit more time on your craft of poetry, because there will certainly be someone who visits with us who is a poet or a writer or an artist, and is really interested in learning how you have really owned that and thrived and impacted readers all over the world. Would you give some advice for those that want to pursue that as their focus? Specifically, what happens when it gets really hard and you don't think anybody wants to read your stuff?
Yeah,
I think it's been a long time since you've experienced that, but think about way back.
I mean, the page is blank for all of us, and so the next poem is always equally as hard, no matter how much you've done it. And in fact, as you start to proceed, in a way, you get used to your tricks and you don't want to repeat those. At least I don't. And so how do you make it new, as they say? But for me, I think, there's sometimes all this advice, write what you know. I think that can be a good place to start, but I really think you have to write what you want to discover. And some of what you want to discover is things you can't help. You have to write about, your family in some way, even if it's an oblique way, or, I had a number of loved ones die, and, no one wants to write an elegy, but here you are, you're having to do it. And I guess it's sort of a lesson of pushing aside that the natural editor one has, or even maybe an unnatural one who sits on your shoulder, and just, especially early on, just writing what you need to write, learning what you need to learn, going places that might surprise you. I started off writing by hand, so I think the hand sometimes can be really interesting and take you in different places, but you have to not be afraid as you're starting writing a poem or anything to end up at a place that you didn't think you were going to be. I turn to music a lot as inspiration, but I think that sense of improvisation that courses through Black culture, both in things like the blues and jazz all the way to hip hop, but also I think in other things from fashion to conversation, are ways of framing that and letting yourself, go afield in order to come back. I think of a jazz solo in the way that it tells a story, and it has to have an emotional story, not just I went here, I went there. The story has to be an internal one. And that kind of journey, in a funny way, is the same kind of journey I think the museum takes. It's connecting these things that don't, you might in the abstract say, what are all these things? And then you have to figure out, both as a curator, but also I think as a visitor, and I think visitors do this intuitively, those connections and the ways that these things tell a broader story. And you have to let that story come out. You have to let the objects tell the story. You have to let the poem come to you and tell the story, and the images that stick with you or the stories you want to tell. You can't necessarily force them. You have to let them come out. So some of it's an attitude, some of it is keeping at it, stick-to-itiveness, and some of it is being generous to those first drafts, that early self even, and then sometimes you have to be a little ruthless later and let the editor come in, but you have to keep that editor at bay for a long time to get to the place of, let's call it inspiration, but I think of innovation and improvisation.
Thank you for sharing that, Kevin. Couple of things just to reinforce that you said. The page starts blank for everyone. Write what you need to say. Attitude, stick to itness. That's super important for all of us, honestly. To go forth, to discover, to dare to discover, and I think it's a terrific moment to prepare to close. Thank you so much for this extraordinary conversation, taking us into your journey. And if I might ask you to share a poem to bring us home. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Thanks so much, Edith. This is a short poem from my book, Brown, which was a few years ago. It's a book that comes out of living in Topeka, Kansas, where it's just part where I lived growing up. And in my church was Linda Brown of Brown v. Board. She played the piano. And so that sense of history being, nearby, 10 feet away, singing, was always there for me growing up. But it also was a chance to think about brownness more generally. And I wanted to write about my son, who was growing up over the time I was writing the book. And this is a poem called Whistle, about the moment when he learned to whistle. Whistle. And then he can whistle, this sun, moon of mine circling, the name we gave to the far side of the satellite, this thunder in the near distance, heralding summer, grown thirsty, plummeting down, suddenly drenching the dog and drought-fed lawn. Nothing, for once, is wrong. Cicadas quieted. The rain's metal smell, a train on time arriving, and that sound now his, as if a kiss might make music. Let's whistle.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us for our Medley Moments conversation. Look forward to some food and some learning on my next visit.
Yes, we'll break bread for sure and continue this conversation and fellowship. So I appreciate it.
Look forward to it. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks.